There is a sentence so simple, yet so piercing, that once you hear it you can never forget it. The empath is the child who was never allowed to be selfish. At first, it sounds almost too plain, almost too obvious. But if you carry the weight of empathy in your bones, if you have spent your life carrying others while quietly drowning yourself, you know how much truth is hidden inside those words. Think back to the earliest years of your life. Most children are noisy, demanding, unafraid to cry out when they are hungry or tired, bold enough to say this is mine or I want that now. It is part of how a child learns their edges, how they discover that they exist as a person separate from everyone else. But for the child who becomes the empath, this stage is cut short. You learn very early that your wants were dangerous, that your feelings came at too high a cost. Perhaps when you asked for too much, you were met with silence. Perhaps when you expressed anger, you were punished. Perhaps when you showed need, love was withdrawn. And in that moment of rejection, you were taught a lesson that would shape your whole life, that your safety depended not on claiming space, but on shrinking yourself. Carl Jung recognized that children who carry this wound grow into adults who live with an invisible weight. Outwardly, they appear strong, compassionate, endlessly giving. But inside, there is a tender scar, the scar of a child who never got to fully exist. What the world admires as sensitivity and selflessness was, in truth, a survival strategy. You learned to read the room like a book because you had to. You learned to sense moods, anticipate conflict, and soften yourself to keep the peace because it was the only way to feel safe. This is how empaths are made. Not simply by nature, but by necessity. And here lies the paradox of the empath's life. You are praised for being selfless, yet that very selflessness often leaves you feeling invisible. People come to you for comfort, for understanding, for healing. They lean on your kindness, they pour their troubles into your open heart. And while you give and give, a quiet part of you aches with the question, when will anyone carry me? When will anyone see me? The world claps for your compassion, but it rarely notices your exhaustion. The world loves your giving, but it rarely asks what it costs you to give so much. This cost is not small. It seeps into every corner of life. In relationships, you may find yourself with partners who take more than they give, because deep down you were trained to accept imbalance as normal. At work, you may pour yourself into tasks, carrying the emotional labor others ignore, and still wonder why you feel unappreciated. Among friends and family, you may always be the one who listens, the one who fixes, the one who soothes, and yet feel strangely alone in your own struggles. This loneliness is not an accident. It is the voice of that child inside you, still waiting to be chosen, still longing for the day when their needs matter as much as everyone else's. And here is where Jung's insight becomes so important. He saw that individuation, the journey of becoming your true self, cannot happen until you reclaim what was taken from you in childhood. For the empath, that means reclaiming selfishness. Not in the cruel sense of using others, but in the sacred sense of daring to exist for yourself. To say no when something drains you. To say yes to joy without guilt. To rest without apology. To acknowledge that your life is not just about carrying others, but about living fully, breathing deeply, feeling your own desires, and honoring your own needs. But this shift does not come easily. For the empath, selfishness feels like a betrayal. Even the smallest act of choosing yourself can stir up guilt so heavy it feels unbearable. You may catch yourself apologizing for resting, for saying no, for not answering a message right away. You may feel the old fear rising, the fear that if you stop giving, love will disappear. This is the shadow of your childhood, whispering that you only deserve affection if you keep sacrificing. And yet, this whisper is not truth. It is conditioning. And conditioning can be broken. Healing begins the moment you realize that the guilt you feel for choosing yourself does not belong to you. It belongs to the past. It belongs to the people who taught you that your needs were too much. It belongs to the childhood where you were forced to be selfless to survive. That guilt is not your voice. This is why Jung's final message is both painful and liberating. Painful, because it forces you to see the wound behind your gift. Liberating, because it reminds you that you do not have to remain trapped in it forever. The empath is the child who was never allowed to be selfish. But as an adult, you have the power to break that pattern. You have the right to reclaim selfishness as selfhood, to take up space, to choose yourself without fear. And perhaps most importantly, to realize that your worth has never depended on how much you give. You are not loved because you erase yourself. You are not valuable because you carry everyone else's pain. You are worthy simply because you exist. And the child inside you, the one who was never allowed to want, to demand, to take, is still waiting for you to remember this. This is where the journey begins. When an empath grows up carrying the wound of never being allowed to be selfish, that wound does not stay in the past. It follows them quietly into adulthood, shaping every choice, every relationship, every feeling of worth. You may look around and see yourself in a career, in friendships, even in love, and still wonder why you feel drained, why you feel unseen, why you carry an invisible weight even on days when everything looks fine from the outside. The truth is that the child who was never allowed to claim space is still inside you, whispering in every moment of your life. Carl Jung believed that what we do not face in childhood, we repeat in adulthood. He called this the shadow, the hidden part of ourselves that carries all the pain, the guilt, the fear, and the longing we were never allowed to show. For the empath, that shadow is full of silenced cries, unspoken needs, and stolen moments of selfish joy. It is the tantrum that was never thrown, the hunger that was never satisfied, the love that was never unconditional. And because that shadow remains unseen, it begins to control us. It pulls us toward the same patterns, the same dynamics, the same imbalance that feels so strangely familiar. This is why so many empaths find themselves repeating the same painful cycles. You may notice that you attract partners who take far more than they give. You may find yourself working tirelessly in jobs where your efforts go unnoticed, while others receive the credit. You may notice that you are always the one friends turn to in crisis, yet when you are the one in pain, the room grows quiet, the phone stays silent, and you are left wondering why nobody shows up for you. At first, this feels like bad luck. But if you look closer, it is not coincidence. It is the old wound playing itself out again and again, trying to teach you something you were never taught as a child, that you are allowed to exist for yourself. And here is the cruelest part of this pattern. On the surface, people may praise you. They may tell you how strong you are, how kind, how selfless. They may admire your patience, your generosity, your capacity to love without limits. And a part of you glows with that praise because deep down you are still that child who wants to be seen, who wants to be valued. But beneath the glow is an ache, a heaviness, because you know that they are not seeing you. They are only seeing what you give. They are admiring the mask, not the person. And when the mask slips, when you finally show your exhaustion, when you dare to ask for something in return, suddenly the admiration fades. Suddenly you are told you are too much, too needy, too sensitive. And once again, you feel like the child who was punished for wanting. Jung understood that this is the trap of the empath. You become addicted to giving, not because it makes you whole, but because it is the only way you were ever taught to receive love. You learn that love must be earned, that affection must be bought with sacrifice, that belonging only comes when you erase yourself. And so, even as an adult, you find yourself repeating that bargain, giving more than you have, carrying more than you should, in the desperate hope that this time it will be enough, that this time someone will stay. But here is the turning point. The wound may have been formed in childhood, but you are not that child anymore. You are an adult with choices, with awareness, with the power to rewrite the story. Jung believed that healing comes when we turn toward the shadow, when we stop running from the pain and finally face it. For the empath, that means daring to look at the guilt, the fear, the shame that rises when you consider putting yourself first. It means noticing the old voices that whisper, if you rest, you are lazy. If you say no, you are selfish. If you take, you are unworthy. And instead of believing them, it means pausing and asking, whose voice is this? Where did I learn this? And does it really belong to me? You may be surprised at how much of what you believe about yourself is not yours at all. It is the echo of parents who were overwhelmed, of caregivers who could not handle your needs, of family members who shamed you for wanting more. It is the echo of a society that values productivity over presence, giving over receiving, silence over truth. None of it is your true voice. Beneath the echoes, beneath the guilt, there is another voice waiting. A quiet, steady voice that says, I deserve to exist. I deserve to take up space. I deserve to be loved for who I am, not just for what I give. The journey of healing begins when you start listening to that voice. At first, it will feel faint, almost fragile. You may doubt it. You may dismiss it. But with time, with practice, with small acts of courage, it grows louder. Every time you say no when you mean no, the voice grows stronger. Every time you rest without apology, it grows steadier. Every time you ask for help, every time you choose joy, every time you dare to be seen in your rawness instead of your performance, the voice begins to replace the old echoes. And slowly, the empath who was once trapped in self-erasure begins to awaken. Imagine this shift for a moment. Imagine a life where your giving is no longer rooted in fear, but in freedom. Imagine loving others not because you have to, but because you choose to. Imagine setting boundaries without guilt, resting without shame, and receiving without apology. This is not selfishness in the way you were taught to fear it. This is sacred selfishness. The kind that honors the child inside you and says, you matter too. And when you begin to live this way, something extraordinary happens. You no longer attract the takers who prey on your selflessness. You no longer repeat the old cycles of abuse and imbalance. Instead, you begin to draw in people who see you, who respect you, who love not just what you give but who you are. You begin to feel whole, because for the first time in your life, you are no longer abandoning yourself. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation. It is not about becoming perfect, or endlessly giving, or transcending your humanity. It is about becoming real, about embracing every part of yourself, even the parts you were told to hide. For the empath, individuation means stepping out of the role of caretaker and into the fullness of being a person. It means breaking free from the belief that love must be earned, and realizing that love is your birthright. The empath is the child who was never allowed to be selfish. But healing means you no longer have to live as that child. Healing means you can finally grow into the adult who chooses freely, who gives from fullness, who loves without losing themselves. And when you do, you discover something remarkable. You realize that your empathy, the very thing that was once born of survival, becomes even more powerful when it is rooted in freedom. You no longer give to avoid rejection. You give because your heart is overflowing. You no longer sacrifice yourself to keep others close. You walk beside those who honor your boundaries. You no longer disappear into other people's pain. You stand in your own light, and from that light you bring comfort without losing yourself. This is the beginning of the empath's true power. And so the empath grows into adulthood carrying a paradox inside them, a split that has existed since their earliest memories. Outwardly, they are the one everyone can count on. Friends describe them as loyal, endlessly understanding, always there in a crisis. Family leans on them as the problem solver, the one who smooths over tension before it turns into conflict. Strangers can feel it too, that quiet openness, that almost invisible signal that here is a person who will not turn you away, who will listen even when they are tired, who will hold space even when they themselves are hurting. The empath becomes the soft landing place in a world that is hard and unyielding. But inwardly, there is another reality. The reality of exhaustion that no amount of sleep erases. The reality of loneliness that persists, even in rooms full of people. The reality of a soul that has spent so long catering to others that it has forgotten the taste of its own voice. For the empath, adulthood often becomes a stage where they keep acting out the same role they learned as children, the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the giver. Only now, the stakes are higher, and the audience is larger. They may be admired for their kindness, but admiration does not ease the quiet ache of never truly belonging to themselves. Carl Jung once said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. For the empath, this truth cuts painfully deep. Fate seems to repeat itself in cruel patterns. They find themselves gravitating toward the same kinds of people, the takers, the controllers, the ones who recognize that the empath will always bend, always compromise, always give. Romantic partners who mirror the neglect of childhood. Friends who lean heavily on their kindness but vanish when the empath is in need. Employers who exploit their loyalty, rewarding sacrifice with more demands. Each time, it feels strangely familiar, as though the script has already been written, and the empath already knows their lines. Why does this happen? It is not weakness. It is not bad luck. It is the unconscious seeking resolution. The inner child, still carrying the imprint of early wounds, still searching for the love that never came, repeats the pattern in the hope that maybe this time it will end differently. Maybe this time the giving will be enough. Maybe this time the other person will finally see them, cherish them, protect them. But no matter how much they pour out, the ending is the same. The empath is left depleted, wondering what more they could have given, what more they could have done. Over time, the toll is not just emotional. It is physical. The empath feels fatigue that no rest seems to heal. Their bodies hold the stress, in tight shoulders, in headaches, in stomach pains, in the subtle but constant sense that they are carrying too much. Their emotions, once flowing and responsive, begin to harden. Smiles feel like masks. Conversations feel draining. They may even find themselves withdrawing, not because they do not care, but because caring has become too heavy. The soul itself begins to whisper in protest, warning that something is deeply out of balance. This is the moment when the shadow begins to surface. Jung believed the shadow is not our enemy but our unacknowledged truth. For the empath, the shadow carries everything they were told to bury. It holds the anger they swallowed as children, the rage of being unheard, unseen, dismissed. It holds the longing to be selfish, not in a cruel way, but in the natural human desire to sometimes put the self first. It holds the right to say no, the right to walk away, the right to demand respect. It holds the desire for rest, for solitude, for space. It holds boundaries, those invisible lines that say this is mine, and it must be protected. Yet the empath has been trained to fear this shadow. They were taught that anger is dangerous, that selfishness is shameful, that saying no makes them unlovable. So they avoid it, terrified of what it might mean. But Jung taught that the shadow, when ignored, rules us from the dark. The empath cannot escape it forever. Their exhaustion, their resentment, their quiet despair are all signs that the shadow is pressing at the door, demanding to be seen. The awakening does not always happen in one dramatic moment. Sometimes, it arrives quietly. Perhaps late at night, when they find themselves staring at the ceiling, realizing that their life feels like it belongs to everyone but them. Perhaps during a small interaction, when they hear themselves saying yes and suddenly feel their whole body rebel against the word. Perhaps in the silence after another heartbreak, when they are left wondering how much more they can give before there is nothing left. These are the moments when the unconscious begins to break through. These are the moments when the empath begins to sense that something has to change. And then comes the most radical thought of all. It does not arrive like thunder. It does not roar. It whispers, "What if I matter just as much as everyone else?" At first, the empath recoils. The thought feels dangerous, selfish, even wrong. But slowly it lingers. What if I was allowed to rest? What if I was allowed to say no? What if love did not have to be earned by sacrifice? What if being myself was enough? This is the seed of individuation, Jung's vision of becoming whole. For the empath, it is the beginning of a revolution. The child who was never allowed to be selfish begins to reclaim their right to exist. The adult who has lived as a giver begins to remember that they too are human, with needs and limits and desires that are just as valid as anyone else's. The empath who has been lost in patterns of survival begins, at last, to awaken. It is not an easy path. It requires courage to face the shadow, to reclaim the anger, to honor the boundaries, to allow selfishness to exist without shame. But it is the only path that leads to wholeness. And though the world may resist, though others may not understand, the empath is finally beginning to step into their own life. And that is where the real journey begins. And now the empath begins to step into a world they never realized was waiting for them, a world that has always existed, quietly, beneath the noise of demands and expectations, beneath the weight of obligations, beneath the unrelenting pressure to give without pause. It is the world of their own life, of their own heart, of their own needs, desires, and boundaries. At first, it is just a whisper, a subtle awareness that stirs within them. Perhaps it is the thought that they are allowed to rest without guilt. Perhaps it is the realization that saying no does not make them bad or unlovable. Perhaps it is the dawning sense that their own happiness is not something to be sacrificed endlessly for others. And though the whisper is soft, it carries a force that is impossible to ignore, a force that begins to pull them gently, insistently toward themselves. This is the beginning of individuation, Jung's concept of becoming whole, of reclaiming all the parts of the self that were once hidden, denied, or silenced. For the empath, it is not simply about being selfish, in the childish sense, but about learning that their existence, their feelings, and their choices have intrinsic value. It is about showing the inner child, the one who was never allowed to be selfish, that it is safe now, that it is safe to want, to feel, to rest, to take up space in the world without fear of abandonment or rejection. It is about acknowledging the shadow, those parts of themselves that were pushed away, and welcoming them home. The process is not linear, and it is not easy. It begins with noticing patterns, the recurring cycles that have defined their life for so long. They see the friends who take endlessly without giving in return. They see the partners who demand emotional labor and attention, yet vanish when the empath is in need. They see the workplaces that exploit their loyalty, expecting unwavering commitment, while offering little support. And with this awareness comes both clarity and grief. The empath begins to understand that these patterns are not coincidences. They are echoes of childhood wounds, unconscious repetitions of lessons learned long ago, that love must be earned, that selflessness is required, that their own needs are secondary. But in the clarity comes courage. Quiet courage, almost imperceptible, yet unstoppable. The empath begins to experiment with boundaries, testing them gently at first. They may say no to a friend's request without collapsing inside. They may step away from an obligation without apologizing or justifying. They may take moments of rest simply because they need them. And in each act of claiming themselves, they feel a subtle shift, a gentle expansion of their inner space that had long been compressed by the weight of caring for everyone else. As they practice these small acts of self-possession, something remarkable begins to happen. They start to notice changes in the relationships around them. Some people are unsettled, uncomfortable with this new self-aware presence, and they step back. But others are drawn closer, magnetized by the authenticity and groundedness that comes from someone who is no longer constantly bending to meet external expectations. They attract people who value them not for what they provide, but for who they are. And in doing so, they begin to understand that true connection is never transactional, never earned by exhaustion, never dependent on erasing the self. It is rooted in mutual respect, recognition, and presence. Yet even as the empath experiences these shifts, the old voices linger. The inner critic whispers that selfishness is shameful, that love must always be conditional, that their worth is measured by sacrifice. And each time these voices appear, the empath has a choice, to believe them, or to recognize them as remnants of childhood wounds that no longer define them. Every choice to honor the self, every boundary set, every yes spoken to their own needs, weakens the hold of these old patterns and strengthens the inner truth. They are allowed to exist fully, freely, and lovingly for themselves. The empath now begins to feel the true power of their gift. Empathy, once a burden born from survival and fear of abandonment, transforms into conscious compassion. They can feel deeply without being consumed. They can care without losing themselves. They can love without sacrificing their own well-being. They learn that their emotions are not chains to be endured, but tools to guide them toward truth. They realize that giving from fullness, rather than obligation, creates a resonance that is magnetic, restorative, and authentic. And in this space, the child they once carried silently begins to relax, begins to smile, begins to trust that it is safe to be seen. And so the empath steps fully into life in a new way. They are no longer defined by the endless cycles of giving and depletion. They are no longer bound by the invisible chains of expectations that were imposed on them. They are learning that self-love is not selfish. They are discovering that boundaries are not cruel. They are finally recognizing that their feelings, desires, and existence are not only valid, but necessary. And in this recognition, they find a profound sense of peace, not loud or flashy, but deep, calm, and enduring, like the still surface of a lake after the storm has passed. This peace is a gift of Jungian individuation, a sign that the empath has begun to reclaim the wholeness that was always theirs to claim. They are still compassionate. They are still deeply feeling. But they are now anchored, grounded, and aligned. They have learned that being an empath is not a curse to escape, but a sacred gift to embrace, one that shines brightest when it is rooted in self-respect, self-care, and conscious awareness. And as they move forward, carrying the child who was once silenced, the shadow that was once feared, and the adult who now chooses themselves, they begin to live with quiet power. A power that is not about control, domination, or constant doing, but about presence, awareness, and integrity. The empath is no longer just a caretaker for others. They are a caretaker for themselves, and in doing so, they become capable of love and compassion that is sustainable, balanced, and profoundly life-giving. And now the empath stands at the threshold of a new life, a life that once felt impossible, a life that was always whispered of in the quiet moments of longing and exhaustion. They have carried the weight of the world for so long that it feels almost unnatural to turn inward, to pay attention to their own needs, to honor the rhythms of their own heart. But the moment has come. The moment when the child who was silenced begins to take up space. The moment when the shadow, once feared, has been embraced. The moment when the adult who has survived, who has endured, who has given endlessly, finally says yes to themselves. The awakening is not sudden. It unfolds like a sunrise, slow and patient, illuminating the inner landscape that has been neglected for decades. The empath notices how different the world feels when it is approached from a place of self-possession rather than depletion. Conversations no longer feel like drains on the soul but like opportunities to connect with clarity and presence. Relationships no longer pull them into unconscious cycles of giving and loss but reflect the truth that healthy connection is mutual, respectful, and conscious. Even their own emotions, once overwhelming and confusing, become guides rather than burdens, signaling when to act, when to rest, and when to reclaim the self that has long been overlooked. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who we truly are, integrating the conscious and unconscious, embracing shadow and light. For the empath, this stage is nothing less than profound liberation. They learn to hold space for their own pain without guilt. They learn that anger is not shameful, but a signal of boundaries needing protection. They learn that desire is not selfish, but a compass guiding them toward authenticity. They learn that saying no is not cruelty, but a declaration of self-respect. And in learning these truths, they begin to reclaim the parts of themselves that were never allowed to breathe: the curious child, the wounded child, the playful child, the fearless child, all returning, not scattered, but whole, inside them. The empath also begins to notice how their energy transforms. Where once they were drained by constant giving, now they are replenished by deliberate, conscious care that begins with themselves. They begin to recognize that empathy is a gift when it is given freely, not out of obligation or fear. They understand that they can feel deeply, love profoundly, and still preserve their own boundaries. They see that their sensitivity, once considered a liability, is actually a superpower, allowing them to navigate the world with clarity, intuition, and emotional intelligence that many cannot comprehend. Yet the journey is still tender. Old voices echo from the past, reminding them of rules they were taught to follow, that selfishness is wrong, that love must be earned, that giving is the highest virtue. And each time these echoes arise, the empath pauses, breathing deeply, remembering the truth they have reclaimed. They remind themselves that self-love is not arrogance. They remind themselves that rest is not weakness. They remind themselves that their feelings are valid, their needs are important, and their existence is enough without constant approval from others. This is where the empath realizes the final, most profound truth of their journey, that they are no longer bound by the cycles of the past. The inner child is not lost, the shadow is not feared, and the adult who emerges is fully integrated. They have learned that they are not responsible for fixing everyone, not responsible for earning love through sacrifice, and not responsible for filling spaces that were never theirs to fill. They are free to exist, fully and authentically, in their own life. And this freedom, once unimaginable, becomes their foundation, their sanctuary, their guiding light. With this freedom comes a quiet power. It is the power to choose who they allow into their lives, the power to set boundaries without fear, the power to love without losing themselves, and the power to honor every aspect of who they are. The empath learns that their gift is strongest not when it is exhausted and depleted, but when it is rooted in self-awareness, self-respect, and self-compassion. They understand that they can pour love into the world without losing themselves because their well is full, replenished by deliberate care and conscious attention. And in this final stage, the empath discovers something extraordinary. They recognize that all the suffering, all the exhaustion, all the moments of doubt and despair were not wasted. Each pain, each heartbreak, each cycle of depletion was a teacher guiding them toward wholeness. Each moment of self-neglect revealed the boundaries that must be honored. Each act of giving without reciprocation illuminated the lessons of conscious empathy. And when they finally integrate all of this, the empath experiences a sense of peace and power so profound that it reshapes their entire experience of life. This is the stage Jung pointed to as the final integration, a life lived consciously, emotionally, and spiritually aligned. The empath who once felt lost, invisible, and unworthy now moves through the world with confidence, groundedness, and inner harmony. They are sensitive, yes, but no longer at the mercy of external chaos. They are caring, yes, but no longer depleted by obligation. They are compassionate, yes, but no longer sacrificing themselves for validation or survival. And in this, they become a living testament to the idea that the child who was never allowed to be selfish can grow into an adult who loves fully, gives wisely, and exists unapologetically. And so the journey comes full circle. The empath has learned that being sensitive is not a weakness, that emotional depth is not a curse, and that self-love is not selfish. They have reclaimed the child within, integrated the shadow, and stepped fully into the adult who chooses themselves. And in this choice, they find not just freedom, but a quiet, enduring joy, the kind of joy that comes from knowing they are enough, they are whole, and they are finally home within themselves.